There is a kind of wilderness we walk over every day without ever seeing it. It has no sky and no horizon, no sun to set and no stars to steer by. It is the country under the country. The caves, the shafts, the water-carved passages that run for miles beneath the forests and the farms and the interstate highways, in a darkness so complete and so old that most of it has never held a single ray of light. We think of the wild as something out there, at the edge of the map. But some of the wildest ground in America is straight down, a few feet below the soles of our shoes. People go into it on purpose, cavers and explorers, the curious and the young, drawn by the same pull that sends anyone into any unknown. Most of them come back up, muddy and grinning, into the light. But the underground keeps a ledger of its own, and it settles accounts in a way that no forest or desert ever could. Because a cave does not hide a person by distance, the way open country does. It hides them by depth, and by dark, and by stone. A body can lie 200 feet from an entrance that 10,000 people walk past every year, wedged in a passage no rescuer can reach, and stay exactly where it is, not for a season, not for a decade, but forever. On more than one occasion in this country, the only way to end the tragedy was to leave the person where they lay and seal the cave shut over them. This is a countdown of 13 American caves that took people in and did not give them back. 13 real places, and 13 real people the earth closed over. Some got lost in the dark. Some drowned in it. Some were pinned by the rock itself, alive, within earshot of the surface, and could not be freed. The through line is the oldest fear we have, that the ground is not solid, that it opens, and that it does not always let go. We do not begin with a victim of inexperience, because that would let the rest of us off too easily. We begin with one of the best there was, because the first thing a cave will teach you, if you let it, is that being good at this does not mean the dark has agreed to spare you. In the dry ranch country of Crockett County, in West Texas, there is a cave called 09 Well. It is not a place tourists go. There is no lit walkway, no handrail, no gift shop at the mouth of it. It is a caver's cave, a vertical system that you enter the way you enter most serious caves in that country, by rigging a rope at the surface and lowering yourself down into it, hand over hand, into a darkness that swallows the daylight within the first few body lengths. To go into a place like 09 Well is to accept a particular kind of bargain. You are trading the ordinary safety of the surface, where you can see, where you can breathe, where help is a phone call and a short walk away, for the chance to stand somewhere almost no human being has ever stood. Carvers make that trade gladly. The good ones make it with a discipline that looks, from the outside, almost like paranoia. Redundant lights, checked knots, backed-up anchors, 100 small habits built to keep the bargain from turning fatal. Joe Ivy had all of those habits, and more. He was, by the account of the people who cave in Texas, one of the most skilled vertical cavers in the state. A man who had rigged and descended and climbed back out of pits that would frighten most people simply to look down into. And he was something rarer still. He was a caving rescue instructor. He was one of the people you called, or one of the people who trained the people you called, when something went wrong underground and a caver had to be brought back up hurt, or worse. He had spent years learning not just how to survive a cave, but how to reach the ones the cave had beaten in the tightest and most vertical and most unforgiving places and get them out. If there was a person in Texas who understood, in his hands and his bones, exactly how a cave kills and exactly how to keep it from happening, it was Joe Ivy. On the 30th of September, in the year 2000, he was deep inside 09 Well, working what cavers call a dome climb, ascending a tall vertical feature within the cave. The kind of climb that is part of the exploration itself, the reaching upward into an unmapped space to see where it goes. It is difficult, exposed work, done on rope and rock in the dark. And it is precisely the sort of thing Ivy had done countless times and taught others to do safely. And then, in a moment the record preserves only in its outline, something failed. He fell, roughly 40 feet by the account that survives, and the fall wedged him in the rock, and it killed him. Not a beginner who had wandered in over his head, not a tourist who had ignored a sign. One of the most competent cavers and cave rescuers in the state of Texas, dead at the bottom of a climb he had every reason to believe he could make. Consider what had to happen next, because it is its own kind of unbearable. Joe Ivy could not walk out, and he could not be carried out by two people in an hour. Recovering a body from deep inside a vertical cave is one of the hardest and most dangerous operations in the whole of search and rescue. A slow, technical, back-breaking process of rigging and hauling through the same tight, exposed, lightless passages that made the cave deadly in the first place. And so the people who came to bring Joe Ivy back to the surface were, in many cases, the very cavers he had trained. They used the techniques he had taught them. They brought one of their own teachers up out of the dark, using the knowledge he had given them, for exactly this, never imagining it would be spent on him. There is no dignifying that irony and no way around it. It simply is what happened. This is why 09 well opens the countdown, and not some cautionary tale of a fool who got what fools get. Because the comforting story we tell ourselves about the wilderness, that it punishes only the careless, that competence is a kind of armor, that if we are good enough and careful enough we will always come home, is a story the underground does not believe. A cave is not a forest that you can be experienced enough to read, or a mountain whose weather you can learn to respect from a distance. It is the one environment on this list where the margin is thinnest and the second chances are fewest, where a single failure of rope or rock or judgment in the dark over a drop is very often simply the end. It kills the skilled and the reckless with the same indifference. Joe Ivy proved that in the most painful way a person can prove anything, by being as good as it is possible to be and dying anyway at the bottom of a Texas cave. Hold on to that as we go down, because everything that follows will test it. There will be the inexperienced and the underprepared, the ones who went in with a cheap flashlight and no idea what they were walking toward, and it will be tempting each time to think, well, that would never be me. But remember where we started. Remember that the first man down this list was the one who knew the most, and the cave took him just the same. The dark underground does not grade on preparation. It only asks whether you are inside it, and, on the days it chooses, whether you will ever be allowed back out. Joe Ivy knew more about surviving a cave and about pulling others out of one than almost anyone in Texas, and the dark took him anyway. Underground expertise buys you nothing the Rock agrees to honor. The next man had none of it. Just 2 friends, 3 flashlights, and 3/4 of a mile of cave between him and the sky. The Sloans Valley system is notorious among regional cavers for its deceptive labyrinthine architecture, a series of interconnected chambers that mimic the complexity of a city's underbelly, where passages branch with the logic of a root system. The path Troxell and his companions followed was not a maintained trail, but a challenging route known for its unpredictable verticality. Here, the limestone is polished to a mirror sheen by centuries of seeping water, creating slickened sides that offer no purchase for a rubber sole. The air is heavy with the scent of damp silt and ancient stagnant minerals, an atmosphere that chills the marrow before the physical exertion even begins. As they descended, the humidity clung to them like a shroud, muffling their voices and turning the simple act of breathing into a conscious, labored effort. This section of the cave is characterized by a breakdown floor, a jagged, chaotic jumble of ceiling collapse that requires the steady, deliberate movement of a trained climber. To traverse it with only a narrow, wavering beam is to walk a tightrope of shadow and stone, where the brain must constantly synthesize a 3-dimensional map from a flickering 2-dimensional view. The scale of the subsequent search operation underscored the sheer hostility of the environment. Rescue teams, arriving in the frigid air of a December night, were forced to contend with the reality that the very features that made the cave beautiful, its narrow, twisting solution tubes and steep, muddy slopes, were now logistical walls. Every piece of equipment, from heavy-duty ropes to the metal litters intended for the victim, had to be painstakingly maneuvered through constrictions that were barely wide enough for a human torso. The rescuers worked in a grueling, rotating relay, their bodies slicked with mud, forced to manage their own exhaustion in a subterranean climate where the temperature never fluctuates. They moved through the dark with specialized high-intensity lighting. Yet even with the gear of professionals, the cave fought them at every turn, its tight corners and jagged obstacles turning a recovery that should have been measured in hours into a harrowing multi-day endurance trial against the weight of the mountain itself. The Sloans Valley Cave System in Pulaski County, Kentucky, is not a small, isolated crack in the earth. It is a vast, subterranean labyrinth, a sprawling network of limestone passages that wind for roughly 25 miles beneath the surface of the rolling Kentucky hills. To those who visit it properly, it is a cathedral of geology, a place of immense beauty where the water has spent eons carving out chambers, domes, and long, twisting corridors. But to those who underestimate the nature of the dark, the scale of the system becomes its most dangerous attribute. It is a place where you can travel for miles without ever seeing a sliver of sun, where the terrain changes from a wide, walkable floor to a jagged, slippery incline without a moment's notice, and where the silence is so profound it can begin to feel like a weight. The cave does not demand respect, but the geography of the place ensures that if you do not offer it, the consequences are written in the stone itself. It is a wilderness that requires not just a map, but the knowledge of how to read one. Not just a light, but the understanding that a light is the only thing standing between you and a world where the eyes are useless. On the 16th of December in 2009, Stephen Troxell, a 21-year-old from the local area, entered the Sloans Valley system with two companions. They were not members of a caving club, nor were they equipped with the specialized gear that defines the boundary between a tourist and an explorer. They carried small, handheld flashlights, the kind meant for walking a sidewalk or searching a kitchen drawer, not for navigating the uneven, slick, and treacherous terrain of a limestone cave. In the subterranean world, light is not merely a utility, it is a life support system. A headlamp provides a constant, hands-free beam that moves with your gaze, illuminating the floor, the ceiling, and the walls simultaneously. A handheld light, by contrast, creates a narrow, dancing circle of visibility that leaves the rest of the world in total, abyssal blackness. It forces you to choose what to see and what to ignore, and in a place where a single misstep can mean the difference between a safe landing and a terminal fall, that choice is often the final one you will ever make. They had been inside the cave for some time, navigating the complex tunnels, when they reached a point roughly 3/4 of a mile from the entrance. In the geography of a cave, 3/4 of a mile is an eternity. It is far enough that the air is perfectly still, the temperature is locked in a permanent, damp chill, and the sound of the world above has been entirely erased. They were moving through a section of the cave where the floor dropped away into a cone-shaped pit, a natural dark funnel in the rock that might have been visible to someone with a powerful wide-angle light, but which remained hidden to those relying on the thin, flickering beams of their handheld torches. Stephen Troxell stepped into that space. He did not see the edge until it was beneath his feet. And then, he did not have time to see anything else. He plummeted approximately 60 feet, striking the hard limestone floor at the bottom of the shaft. The impact was absolute. He died from his injuries in the dark, miles away from the life he had left behind, just hours before, in a place that had been there for 1,000,000 years and would remain for 1,000,000 more. The recovery that followed was a grim technical necessity that occupied the local rescue teams for an agonizing stretch of time. Because the accident occurred so deep within the system, the rescuers had to navigate the same treacherous route that had claimed Troxell, bringing the necessary rigging and medical equipment through miles of narrow passages and over difficult terrain. They had to operate in a space where every movement was a risk, and where the very environment that had taken the victim was now a hostile obstacle to those trying to retrieve him. When they finally reached the bottom of the pit, they found not a mystery, but the hard, cold reality of a life cut short by the simplest of errors. There was no malice in the rock, no shifting of the earth, no sudden collapse of a tunnel. There was only the edge of a pit and a light that was not strong enough to show it. It was a tragedy of circumstance, a reminder that the underground is a place where the margin for error is essentially zero, and where a mistake is not something you get to recover from, but something you have to live with, or, as in this case, something you do not live through at all. We often imagine that a cave is a place where one must be an expert to find trouble, but the truth is far more unsettling. The dark does not care about your experience, your credentials, or your intentions. It cares only about your proximity to the hazards it contains. The floor of a cave is not a floor in the way we understand it in our homes. It is a surface of shifting mud, slick flowstone, and hidden vertical drops that the human eye is not naturally tuned to perceive. When you take away the ability to see the topography, you are walking blind, and the cave is always waiting for the moment your balance fails. Troxell's death was a stark, quiet lesson in the vulnerability of the human body when stripped of its primary sense. He was not a climber, not a spelunker, not a thrill-seeker. He was simply a man who believed the ground would hold him because it had always held him before. And in that one final, unlit moment, the ground ceased to be a support and became a void. 3/4 of a mile in, on a flashlight that showed him the next few feet and no more, Stephen Troxell stepped past the edge of a pit he never saw. Kentucky's limestone kept him at the bottom until the rescuers came to bring him home. The next cave is named, almost cruelly, for what it does, and it took a man who was one of the experts the last cave lacked. The approach to the entrance required traversing a limestone-cast landscape that felt less like a wilderness and more like a ruined city of bone. Here, the ground was a treacherous lattice of jagged outcrops and deep, lightless grikes, hidden beneath a deceptively fragile veil of desert scrub. Every step carried the risk of a twisted ankle or a punctured boot. It was a terrain that demanded a rhythmic, almost meditative caution. Yet even the most disciplined footfalls were swallowed by the vast, yawning silence of the high Guadalupes. The cave itself possessed a reputation among local speleologists that verged on the superstitious. It was known as a pit-heavy system, a series of cascading vertical drops that functioned like a gravitational sieve, separating the confident from the careless with surgical precision. To reach the threshold, one had to navigate a landscape that seemed intent on tripping the unwary, leading them toward a fissure that looked, from a distance, like nothing more than a shallow scar in the earth. Once the alarm was raised, the rescue effort unfolded against a backdrop of grueling isolation. The logistics of the search were dictated by the sheer physics of the mountain. Equipment had to be hauled by hand across miles of broken, unforgiving slope where the heat of the day could turn a man to ash and the sudden biting cold of the evening could freeze the sweat in his clothes. Rescuers moved through the upper reaches of the cave in a state of heightened, brittle tension, their headlamps cutting through the gloom to reveal a cathedral of rock that remained stubbornly indifferent to their presence. The scale of the abyss was staggering. As the teams descended, the acoustics of the system shifted. The familiar sounds of the surface, the rasp of breathing, the clink of carabiners, the soft grit of shale underfoot were muffled by the sheer mass of the surrounding stone, replaced by a low, resonant thrum of subterranean air moving through passages that had never felt the heat of the sun. The recovery proved to be a harrowing exercise in patience and precision. The technical demands of rigging a high-angle hole system in a vertical shaft meant that every movement was calculated, every anchor point scrutinized with the intensity of a prayer. The searchers worked in shifts, their silhouettes shifting like ghosts against the damp, glistening walls of the shaft. They operated in a world stripped of color, where the limestone walls transitioned from blinding white to an obsidian gray, and the only geography that mattered was the next ledge, the next projection, and the chilling void that beckoned from below. The air in the lower reaches was still, heavy with the scent of wet mineral and ancient trapped dust, a stillness so profound that it seemed to vibrate against the skin. It was an environment that stripped away the vanity of exploration, leaving only the stark, undeniable reality of a fragile human frame suspended against the crushing indifference of the mountain. High in the Guadalupe Mountains of New Mexico, the limestone does not just hold caves, it seems to inhale the landscape. This is the same ancient fossilized reef that carved out the vast subterranean cathedrals of Carlsbad. But here, the geography is more rugged, more isolated, and far less forgiving. High atop these ridgelines, hidden beneath the scrub and the high-altitude desert sun, lie deep, vertical fissures known to those who map the dark as the Vanishing River Cave. The name is not metaphorical, it is a literal description of what happens to the water in this terrain. It finds a crack, a sink, or a mouth, and it simply ceases to be part of the surface world. It vanishes. It is a place that demands a specific kind of respect, the kind that comes from knowing that once you cross the threshold of the entrance pit, you have effectively exited the territory of the living. To enter Vanishing River is to commit yourself to a descent that is measured not in feet but in the total loss of the sky. On the 4th of September in 1967, 4 men arrived at the mouth of the cave. They were not tourists and they were not wandering into the dark by accident. They were experienced cavers, men who understood the rigging and the rope work required to negotiate a pit that drops hundreds of feet into the cold, silent limestone belly of the Guadalupes. They had arrived with the intention of exploration, of pushing further into the system than the previous map allowed. They arrived with the gear, the training, and the camaraderie that defines the community of those who prefer the deep earth to the wide, open air. Douglas Evans was among them. Like his companions, he knew the risks of the vertical environment. He knew that the limestone is sharp, that the anchors are never guaranteed, and that the distance between a successful descent and a permanent stay is often just a single slip of the boot or a single frayed strand of nylon. The weather that day was shifting, as it often does in the high desert, where a clear morning can turn to a violent, bruising mountain storm in the space of a heartbeat. As the party prepared to enter, the atmosphere around the mountain began to curdle, the air growing heavy with the promise of rain. In the urgency of the moment, as the expedition sought to secure its position and navigate the narrowing window of safety, something went fundamentally wrong at the entrance shaft. There are accidents in the wilderness that defy easy explanation, and there are others that are stripped of all mystery by the sheer cold physics of gravity. Evans, having navigated the climb and the edge of the pit, found himself in a position that left no margin for error. The record preserved in the archives of the National Speleological Society is brief, as such records often are, but its finality is absolute. He fell. It was a long, unforgiving drop into the darkness of the entrance shaft, a distance from which no human being, regardless of their skill, could hope to walk away. In the immediate aftermath, the wilderness did what it does best. It obscured. The storm moved in, the light vanished, and the cave, which had been a destination minutes before, became a tomb. The recovery of a body from such a depth in a remote section of the Guadalupe Mountains is a task that pushes the limits of human endurance and technical capability. It is a logistical nightmare of rigging, hauling, and navigating the same treacherous, jagged stone that caused the fall in the first place. The silence that follows a death in such a place is heavy, a weight that presses down on the rescuers just as surely as the millions of tons of limestone press down on the victim. For Evans, the cave became the final coordinate of his life. There was no struggle against a rising tide, no slow realization of a trap, no agonizing wait for a rescue that might never come. There was only the sudden, violent transition from the mountain air to the absolute crushing stillness of the deep dark. There is an unsettling quality to a place like Vanishing River Cave, a sense that the earth is not merely a container for the dead, but an active participant in their disappearance. When a person falls into a shaft this deep, the cave swallows them whole, leaving no trace for the wind or the rain to find. The surface above remains indifferent. The scrub brush continues to grow, the hawks circle the ridgeline, and the mountain itself remains a monument of stone that offers no testimony to what lies beneath. We often speak of wilderness as a place of beauty, of vistas and renewal, but Vanishing River is a stark reminder of the other side of that coin. It is a place of absolute finality. It is a place where the landscape itself has been hollowed out, creating a void that waits for the unsuspecting or the unlucky to fill it. Even here, in a cave named for how completely the world can disappear underground, it was the oldest hazard that took Douglas Evans: a fall, a shaft, the dark at the bottom. But the next cave killed without a fall, without a squeeze, without a single visible wound. It killed with the air itself, leaving two men in a space that looked perfectly safe, yet had been turned into a gas chamber by the work of the surface world. The passages of the Staunton Quarry Cave were not the elegant cathedral-like galleries of popular imagination, but a tortuous, cramped network of crawlways and tight vertical chimneys that demanded a constant, grueling physicality. The limestone here was sharp, serrated by the geologic grinding of eons, creating an environment that stripped away the veneer of comfort within seconds of entry. To traverse these veins, a caver had to be a contortionist, shedding the grace of a human gait for the primitive, sliding locomotion of a reptile. It was a place defined by its claustrophobia, where the walls seemed to lean in, impatient and encroaching, forcing a traveler to commit their entire silhouette to the stone. The cave held a reputation among local spelunkers for its fickle nature. It was known to be a tight-fit system, a labyrinth that punished the impulsive and rewarded only the most methodical. When Vaught and Miller failed to emerge at the appointed hour, the search that followed was a grim testament to the logistical nightmare of subterranean recovery. Rescue teams did not merely walk into the dark. They had to navigate a landscape that defied traditional rescue efforts. The cave's topography was a series of choking bottlenecks and vertical drops that required specialized rigging, forcing rescuers to haul heavy equipment through apertures that barely accommodated a human shoulder width. As the hours stretched into a second day, the atmosphere inside the cave began to tell its own story. The initial searchers encountered the same invisible adversary that had claimed the two men, feeling the sudden, dizzying onset of a profound lethargy that forced them to retreat or risk becoming casualties themselves. The air was heavy, viscous with the hidden toxicity of the quarry's blast, a miasma that hung suspended in the stagnant gloom. The recovery process was a slow, agonizingly delicate operation. Rescuers were forced to use self-contained breathing apparatuses, their own gasps sounding unnaturally loud and metallic against the uncaring rock. The cave did not reveal its victims easily. They were discovered in the depths, curled in positions that suggested they had simply sat down to rest, their bodies preserved in the perpetual cool temperature of the subterranean vault. There was no evidence of a struggle, no scratched stone or broken gear to indicate a moment of panic. They had succumbed to the chemistry of the void, their life force siphoned away by an element so fundamental it was taken for granted. In the recovery, the rescuers moved with a heavy, muted reverence, navigating the same narrow chutes and jagged limestone ridges that had served as the final resting place for their colleagues, fully aware that the silent, invisible danger that had silenced Vaught and Miller still clung to the damp walls, waiting for the slightest shift in pressure to claim another. The Staunton Quarry Cave in Virginia is, to the untrained eye, little more than a jagged aperture in the side of a hillside, a modest opening that suggests a simple, subterranean passage. It sits adjacent to a working limestone quarry, a place of industrial noise and mechanical activity, where the stone is torn from the earth in vast, echoing slabs. But the cave itself exists in a different rhythm, one governed by the absolute stillness of deep, stagnant air. A cave is not a living room that ventilates with the opening of a door, it is a sealed vault. If the air inside becomes fouled, it does not blow away, and it does not dissipate. It pools. It waits in the depressions and the dead-end chambers, a silent, invisible weight that can render a passage deadly long before a person sees or smells a reason to turn back. This is the peculiar clinical horror of the subterranean world. The threat is often not a precipice or a constriction, but the very oxygen you rely on to survive. On the 26th of July, in 1967, two men named Charles Vaught and John Miller decided to explore this cave. They were cavers, familiar with the reality that the underground is a world of shadows, but they were about to encounter a hazard that transcends even the most rigorous training in navigation or ropework. Days before they arrived, the nearby quarry had conducted a heavy blast of dynamite. The concussion of the explosion had fractured the limestone, opening fissures and pathways that allowed the concentrated deadly byproduct of the blast carbon monoxide to seep from the quarry's operations into the deepest reaches of the cave system. Carbon monoxide is the perfect killer of the underground. It is colorless, it is odorless, and it is entirely tasteless. It does not irritate the throat or sting the eyes. It simply replaces the oxygen in the blood, starving the brain and the body until the victim loses consciousness, often without ever realizing they are in distress. Vaught and Miller entered the cave in the middle of a summer day, expecting the usual challenge of a limestone system: the damp, the darkness, the physical exertion of climbing and squeezing. They had no way of knowing that the still, heavy air inside the passage had become a lethal chemical trap. As they ventured deeper, the atmosphere changed from a life-sustaining breath to a silent, suffocating presence. There was no struggle against a rising flood, no panic-inducing collapse of rock, and no harrowing realization of a missed footing on a slick ledge. There was only the slow, creeping depletion of their ability to move, to think, and eventually to breathe. The cave did not need to fight them. It simply existed, holding its breath with the deadly gas trapped within its walls. And as they moved further into the void, the air they inhaled robbed them of their lives in a matter of minutes. The tragedy at Staunton Quarry became a foundational, sobering lesson for the caving community. It served as a stark, permanent reminder that the danger of a cave is not always visible to the human eye. Experienced cavers learn to look for the signs: the guttering of a flame, the sudden lethargy, the heaviness of the atmosphere. But in the absolute dark, those signs are often far too subtle to detect until it is already too late. The death of Vaught and Miller was a quiet, clinical expiration, a reminder that the subterranean wilderness is indifferent to the life it contains. It does not require a dramatic accident to claim a person. It only requires the presence of a traveler in a place where the chemistry of the air has been compromised. The cave remained, as it had for thousands of years, a silent, unmoving vault of stone, keeping the secret of what had transpired inside its throat. The horror of their end lies in the mundane nature of their entry. They walked in expecting to return to the sun, and the rock allowed them to penetrate deep into its interior before the environment turned against them. It was a death of absolute isolation, occurring in a place that seemed, until the very last moment, like any other passage they had explored. The cave did not offer a warning, and it did not offer a way out. It simply held them, a testament to the fact that the earth beneath our feet is a complex, fragile machine, and sometimes the most dangerous thing about it is the very act of drawing a breath. Staunton Quarry remains a reminder that we are guests in a world that does not provide for our needs, and that silence in a cave is not always the silence of peace. It is often the silence of a trap that has already sprung. No edge, no water, no falling rock. Staunton Quarry killed two men with nothing but the air they breathed invisibly in minutes. A cave does not need a weapon. Sometimes it is the weapon. The next cave was cruder and older about it. It let a man crawl in, and then it simply would not let him crawl back out. The trail leading to the mouth of the cave wound through the jagged, limestone-laced scrub of the Wichita Mountains, a landscape defined by weathered granite outcrops and deceptive scrub-choked ravines. It was the kind of arid, unforgiving terrain where the surface topography seemed designed to discourage casual wanderers, yet the area held a localized reputation for harboring small, subterranean anomalies that local youths occasionally sought out as a rite of passage. The entrance itself, a narrow vertical fissure tucked behind a cluster of limestone boulders, offered no warning of the internal geometry that awaited. It functioned like a funnel, pulling the unsuspecting down into a throat of stone that transitioned quickly from a crawl to a near-vertical claustrophobic slide. When the search began, the gravity of the situation was initially obscured by the misleadingly small appearance of the opening. Rescuers arrived expecting a standard extraction, perhaps a dislocated limb or a minor obstruction, but they were met instead with the reality of a site that refused to cooperate with the tools of the modern world. The passage was not merely tight, it was a tortuous, Z-shaped geological anomaly that effectively sealed itself off from any meaningful intervention. Specialized cave rescue teams tasked with navigating the subterranean maze found that the very walls of the cave were composed of sharp, unyielding chert and limestone plates that acted like natural teeth, grabbing and holding any material that attempted to pass through. The search effort quickly morphed from a recovery mission into a grim mechanical assessment of physics. Engineers and rescue technicians spent hours attempting to stabilize the shifting debris around the victim, only to discover that the cave's structural integrity was tied to the very rock that held him. Every attempt to shift a stone or widen the passage threatened a cascade of loose rubble from the ceiling, effectively pinning the rescuers into a position of paralyzed observation. The eerie, claustrophobic reality was that the rescuers were forced to stand within earshot of the victim, communicating across a distance of only a few feet that felt, through the lens of the cave's architecture, like an insurmountable chasm. They were forced to reconcile with the auditory feedback of a trapped man in a space where they could hear his labored respiration, yet could not deploy the hydraulic jacks or mechanical levers necessary to shift the squeeze without risking the collapse of the entire passage. The atmosphere inside the tunnel grew thick with a combination of stagnant, humid air and the palpable, heavy despair of a rescue that could not be executed. It was a sterile, mechanical tragedy. The cave possessed no grand mythology, no ancient curse, only a precise, lethal indifference to the biology of a human being caught in a geological misalignment. There are places in the limestone country of Oklahoma that seem from the surface to be little more than unremarkable fissures in the earth, shallow, jagged openings hidden by brush and the quiet shade of the scrublands. Hermit Cave is one such place. It does not boast the grand, cathedral-like chambers or the miles of echoing, river-carved tunnels that draw seasoned explorers to the great systems of the East. It is a small, claustrophobic environment, the kind of opening that might appear to a casual observer as a simple curiosity, a gateway to a hidden room that looks like it might be explored with a pair of sturdy boots and a handheld light. It is easy to look at a hole in the ground that is just barely wide enough to accommodate the breadth of a human torso and mistake it for a challenge. It is even easier to mistake it for a path. On the 6th of April in 1999, Robert Canady came to the entrance of Hermit Cave with his stepbrother. He was not a member of any caving club. He had no formal training in the mechanics of rope work or the navigation of narrow subterranean passages, and he lacked the specialized equipment that acts as a buffer between a caver and the raw, unyielding nature of the rock. He was simply a man who had decided to see what lay inside. There is a profound difference between the world above and the world below that many do not grasp until they are already too deep to turn back. Above, you have space. You have the ability to move your limbs, to expand your lungs, to shift your weight as the terrain demands. In a passage like the one inside Hermit Cave, that freedom of movement vanishes entirely. The rock is not a passive wall, it is a weight that presses against you from every side, defining exactly how you may move and, more importantly, whether you may return. As Canady moved deeper into the cave, the passage began to constrict. It is a phenomenon that defies the logic of the surface. A person might slide through a gap with little effort, their shoulders brushing the stone on either side, only to find that the passage ahead narrows by just a few inches, enough to make the return journey impossible. When a human body enters a squeeze of that nature, it is often a one-way path. To back out, one must be able to expand their chest, to push against the rock, and to find the leverage necessary to retreat. But if the stone is tight enough to prevent that expansion, if the ribs cannot lift and the air cannot move into the lungs, the cave creates a trap of absolute crushing stillness. Robert Canady became wedged in one of these tight, unyielding constrictions. The record of his final hours is a matter of documented, terrible fact. He was caught in a position that made escape a physical impossibility. There was no room to maneuver, no space for the rescuers who would eventually arrive to pull him free, and, ultimately, no way for his own body to sustain the basic act of breathing. When a person is trapped in such a way, the cave does not act with malice. It simply sits with the weight of the mountain above it, unmoved and indifferent to the life that has become lodged within its seams. He remained there, held by the stone, as his stepbrother and the local authorities faced the reality of a situation that defied all standard rescue efforts. The constriction was too tight, the rock too dense, and the path into that specific section of the cave too narrow for the mechanical tools required to shift the earth. There is a particular hollow silence that settles over a place like this once the realization hits that no help can reach the victim. It is a silence that belongs to the earth, not to the living. The tragedy of Hermit Cave lies in the intimacy of the trap. It was not a grand, sprawling cavern where one could get lost for days in a labyrinth of tunnels. It was a single point of failure, a constriction that looked like a doorway but functioned as a lock. It serves as a stark, harrowing reminder that you do not need to be miles underground to be beyond the reach of the world. You only need to be in a place where the stone has decided to close around you. Hermit Cave did the simplest and most terrible thing a cave can do. It let Robert Canady in through a gap it would not let him back out of, and it held him while the dark did the rest. Remember the shape of that, a body, alive, wedged in stone that will not open. It is the shape this whole countdown is climbing toward, a recurring nightmare of the subsurface world. But if the squeeze represents the claustrophobic dread of the narrow passage, there is another, perhaps more violent, danger that haunts the underground. It is the hazard of the vertical, where the depth is not measured in inches of constriction, but in hundreds of feet of empty, lightless air, a place where the floor is not a ceiling, but a destination you reach in a single, irreversible moment of descent. The trek to the mouth of Valhalla is a study in quiet endurance, a mile-long pilgrimage through a dense, tangled thicket where the humidity of the Alabama summer clings to the skin like a damp shroud. The woods here are deceptive, draped in the verdant, suffocating greenery of an untamed ridge, where the limestone outcrops protrude from the leaf litter like the jagged teeth of some buried leviathan. Locals speak of the region's topography with a wary reverence. The ground is honeycombed, riddled with sinks that act as natural drainage for the forest floor. It is a landscape that demands a heavy price for a momentary lapse in footing, a place where the earth is constantly shifting, settling, and breathing beneath the dense canopy. Reaching the pit requires navigating a steep, brush-choked incline that discourages all but the most committed, leaving the entrance tucked away in a remote, shaded hollow that feels intentionally obscured from the casual passerby. When the alarm finally reached the surface, the mobilization for the recovery underscored the immense scale of the pit's physical reality. Rescuers did not arrive at a simple site. They arrived at a vertical abyss of staggering proportions, a limestone throat that swallowed sound and light with equal indifference. To descend into Valhalla is to leave the terrestrial world entirely, entering a cathedral of damp stone where the air temperature plummets and the acoustics are distorted by the sheer volume of the void. The search teams faced the daunting logistical nightmare of a technical recovery in a space where every piece of equipment, every stretcher, and every medic had to be lowered by rope, one by one, through the narrow, constricting bottleneck of the entrance. There is an eerie clinical stillness to the deep interior of such a cave, an atmosphere where the passage of time seems to warp. The walls are slick with a slow geologic weeping, and the silence is punctuated only by the rhythmic, hollow drip of water striking stone, a sound that, to the ears of those performing the recovery, took on a rhythmic, almost mocking quality. The searchers moved through a space where the ceiling vanishes into a gloom that no flashlight can fully penetrate, feeling the immense weight of the mountain pressing down from above. It is a place of profound isolation where the scale of the architecture makes the human presence feel ephemeral, almost accidental. As the rescue crews worked through the night, the cave remained entirely unmoved by their exhaustion or their urgency, its dark, porous lungs breathing in the humid forest air and exhaling a cold, mineral-scented silence that seemed to swallow their efforts. Even in the presence of a tragedy, the cave continued its ancient subterranean work, indifferent to the broken stillness of the floor. In the rugged limestone folds of northeastern Alabama, where the rolling hills of the Cumberland Plateau break into deep, jagged fissures, lies a region known to the community of explorers simply as TAG, the intersection of Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia. It is a land of subterranean cathedrals, a landscape so riddled with cavities that the ground is more whole than solid earth. Among these, Valhalla Cave stands as a daunting, vertical monolith. It is not a cave that you walk into, it is a chasm you descend into, a place where the floor is not a surface to stand on, but a destination you reach only after hundreds of feet of suspended, solitary transit through a vertical shaft that leaves the sky behind almost immediately. Vertical caving is an art form of extreme calculated precision. It is the practice of traversing the deepest, most inaccessible reaches of the earth by hanging from a single strand of static rope. It demands a mechanical understanding of friction, load, and gravity. A caver in a place like Valhalla is entirely dependent upon the integrity of their harness, the reliability of their ascenders, and the absolute perfection of the knots they tie by the light of a headlamp. When you are 200 feet down, suspended in a column of air that has not seen the sun in a geologic age, you are effectively living on the edge of a physical equation where the only variable is the equipment. There is no ledge to step onto if a knot slips. There is no wall to grab if the rigging fails. There is only the rope, and the dark, and the bottom. Trever Cole was a 21-year-old student from Purdue, a young man who had found his way to the Alabama backcountry in the heat of July 2019. He was part of a group of 5, a team of peers drawn by the same impulse that has driven explorers into the earth for generations, the desire to see what the map has left blank. They were not there for a tour. They were there for the rigors of the descent. They were prepared, they were equipped, and they were, by all accounts, aware of the gravity of the environment they were entering. To enter Valhalla is to commit to a technical ordeal that requires total focus from the moment your boots leave the surface of the earth until the moment they touch down in the silence of the abyss. On that July afternoon, the party arrived at the lip of the Great Pit, a vertical drop that reaches roughly 227 feet from the upper opening to the floor below. It is a distance that defies the scale of the surface world. It is tall enough that a person is reduced to a speck against the limestone, a flicker of light in a void. As the descent began, the reality of the cave asserted itself. At some point during the transition, as Cole worked to adjust his rigging to navigate the immense height, the system encountered a fatal complication. Something in the arrangement of the rope or the mechanical connection to the anchor points failed. There was no time to react. No possibility of a secondary safety catching the weight of a body in freefall. Cole fell the entire height of the pitch, striking the floor below with the force of a descent that had no break. The aftermath was a scene of clinical, hollow tragedy. The remaining members of the party, trapped by the very verticality they had come to explore, were forced to grapple with a reality that no amount of training can fully prepare a human mind for. The cave, which had been a site of curiosity and physical challenge, became in a heartbeat a tomb. Rescuers were summoned, but the recovery of a body from the bottom of Valhalla is a task that requires the same technical mastery that led the explorer down in the first place. The silence that fills that pit after such a fall is a heavy, crushing thing. A silence that seems to press against the limestone walls, indifferent to the loss of the life that just arrived, and just as abruptly ended. It is a sobering realization that in the world of the underground, the equipment is not just a tool, it is a life support system in an environment that is fundamentally hostile to human existence. We place our faith in nylon and steel, in the physics of a loop and a carabiner, and we convince ourselves that because we have mastered the mechanics, we have conquered the risk. But the cavern does not care about the quality of the gear or the intent of the explorer. It is a space defined by gravity, and gravity is a law that never offers a pardon. For Trever Cole, the rope was everything, and for one terrible, unrecoverable instant, it ceased to be enough. The tragedy of Valhalla lies in the suddenness of the transition from a living, breathing adventurer to a statistic in an accident report. It serves as a stark reminder that in the vertical world, you are always one knot away from the end. But there are other places where the danger is not a vertical drop that tests your ropes, but a flooded passage that tests your resolve. In the next few chapters, the air itself vanishes, replaced by the crushing pressure of water that fills every crevice, every tunnel, and every breath. The darkness down there is not empty, it is fluid, and it has claimed those who thought they could swim through the stone. To understand the scope of the void he stepped into, one must look at the geography of the spring itself. It is a vertical chimney, a flooded karst feature that plunges into the subterranean plumbing of the Floridan aquifer. The water is sourced from deep within the earth, constant and cold, maintaining a temperature that saps the heat from a human body with relentless efficiency. Long before McDaniel arrived, the system had earned a reputation among the diving elite as a place of shifting, deceptive topography. It is a labyrinth of solution cavities where the rock has been eaten away by acidic groundwater into jagged, uneven fins and claustrophobic corridors. The walls are not smooth. They are abrasive, limestone teeth that snag the delicate nylon of a harness or the corrugated rubber of a low-pressure hose. Navigation requires a precise horizontal trim, a buoyancy control that leaves no room for the frantic, erratic pulse of a diver who has lost their reference. The search effort that followed his vanishing was a logistical marvel of endurance and professional grief. It was not merely a matter of sending a rescue party into the shallows, it was an industrial-scale operation that lasted for months. Recovery divers, men and women who had spent their lives traversing the most treacherous flooded voids in the hemisphere, pushed their own limits, tethered to the surface by lines that seemed to go on for miles. They moved through the main basin and into the Vortex proper, a passage that funneled them into darkness so absolute it felt physical. They navigated by the beam of high-intensity HID lamps, cutting through the gloom to scan every nook and cranny of the limestone floor. They moved with the slow, deliberate grace of surgeons, knowing that a single misplaced fin kick against the silty floor could bloom into a brownout, a cloud of sediment so thick it rendered their own hands invisible. The eerie particulars of the investigation centered on the gear found abandoned at a depth of roughly 180 feet. It was a chaotic, discordant arrangement of equipment that suggested a sequence of events defying standard emergency protocols. There were tanks left behind, regulators untouched, and markers placed in ways that signaled either a profound terminal confusion or a desperate struggle against the encroaching dark. Divers traced the cave lines until they frayed into nothingness, pushing into the restriction, a narrow, unmapped throat of the spring where the rock tightens to a degree that barely permits the passage of a human torso. They checked the ceiling, the floor, and the crevices, scanning for the telltale glint of a watch or the unnatural, rectangular outline of a tank. Yet the water remained stubbornly empty. The searchers returned to the surface time and again with nothing to report but the terrifying scale of the space they had just exited, a place that seemed to have swallowed a man whole and then folded its stone lungs back over the empty, silent dark. In the Florida Panhandle, near the town of Ponce de Leon, the earth does not merely open, it bleeds. Vortex Spring is a deep limestone-fed basin where the water is famously clear, a crystalline blue that seems to defy the humid, tangled growth of the surrounding woods. It is a place that draws thousands of swimmers and casual divers every year, a recreational site where the surface is bright and the bottom is a known, mapped quantity. But for those who look past the roped-off swimming areas and down into the mouth of the main spring, there is a cave. It is an underwater system that reaches back into the limestone, a dark, flooded throat that winds away from the sunlight into a series of jagged, silt-heavy passages. At a specific point, a physical gate is installed, a warning, a barrier to entry for anyone who does not hold the specialized certification required to navigate the terrifying claustrophobic reality of a cave that has no air to breathe and no path to the surface. It is a place where the water is the ceiling and where every movement must be calculated to avoid kicking up the fine sediment that can turn a clear, navigable room into a blind, suffocating fog in a matter of seconds. In August of 2010, a 30-year-old man named Ben McDaniel arrived at this spring. He was not a cave diver, and he held no formal certification for the kind of subterranean navigation that the Vortex Spring system demanded. He was an experienced open-water diver, comfortable in the vast horizontal spaces of the ocean or the open lake, but the transition from open water to a cave is not merely a shift in location. It is a shift in physics, in mindset, and in the fundamental rules of survival. By the accounts of those who saw him, McDaniel became consumed by the cave. He dove it repeatedly, his interest deepening into an obsession that seemed to isolate him from the cautionary rhythms of the local diving community. Witnesses reported that he was attempting to penetrate beyond the restricted gate, pushing into the unexplored, unmapped reaches of the system where the ceiling drops and the walls close in. He was a man who had decided that the boundary between the recreational spring and the true dark wilderness of the flooded limestone was a challenge rather than a warning. On the 18th of August, he descended into the water, and he did not return to the light. When he failed to surface, the assumption was that the cave had simply claimed him, that he had succumbed to the same dangers that have ended the lives of so many others in such environments. Equipment entanglement, a catastrophic loss of visibility, or simply pushing so deep into an unmapped extension that he ran out of the very air he carried on his back. A search was launched, and for months, the diving community worked the system with a thoroughness that was as exhaustive as it was harrowing. They combed the passages, they mapped the silt, and they pushed into the narrow, lightless bottlenecks that McDaniel had purportedly been trying to breach. They expected to find him. In the world of cave diving, the body is almost always located because a cave is a closed container. It is a vessel that, while it may hide a body for a time, eventually reveals it to the light. But they found nothing. They recovered some of his gear, which only deepened the enigma of his disappearance, but of the man himself, there was no trace. This absence, the failure of the cave to produce the person who had entered it, transformed a tragic accident into a persistent, haunting mystery. Theories bloomed in the void left by his absence. Some believed he had become hopelessly wedged in a passage too small for a search diver to follow, buried under the weight of the limestone and the silt. Others, noting the lack of a body in a place that should have yielded one, suggested he had never been in the cave at all, perhaps having succumbed to a darker fate elsewhere and leaving his gear behind as a ruse or a final cryptic signal. Every lead was pursued, and every shadow in the system was illuminated. Yet the facts remained exactly as they were on the day he went under. A man went into the water, his gear was found in the dark, and the earth refused to provide an answer. The mystery of Vortex Spring lies in that silence. It is not the silence of a cave that is merely cold or remote. It is the silence of an answer that has been scrubbed away by the current. We are accustomed to the idea that the wilderness leaves a trail, a piece of clothing, a boot, a bone, a final resting place. But here, the water proved to be a cleaner, more efficient eraser than any forest or mountain. To enter such a place is to accept that you may leave behind not just your life, but the very possibility of being found, of being brought home, or of having your story concluded with the finality that the living crave. A flooded cave almost always gives its dead back. Eventually, that is the grim mercy of still water. Vortex Spring gave back only a scatter of gear and a question no one has closed. Somewhere in the dark water behind that gate, or nowhere at all, is the answer to what happened to Ben McDaniel. The next spring is not a mystery. It is simpler and worse. It took two people from one family in a single afternoon. To reach the mouth of the sink, one must navigate a labyrinth of dense, palmetto-choked scrub that seems designed to frustrate any meaningful progress. The ground here is deceptive, a thin, brittle skin of vegetation concealing the jagged limestone karst that defines the Floridian interior. It is a landscape of claustrophobic humidity, where the air hangs thick and motionless and the silence is punctuated only by the distant rhythmic clicking of insects. Experienced locals knew the area's reputation not for its beauty, but for its treacherous instability. The sinkhole itself was a notorious throat in the earth, a known siphon that pulled water and debris into a complex multi-level gallery of flooded tunnels. When the pair failed to surface, the recovery effort began as a grim, logistical nightmare. Specialized cave recovery teams, the few men and women in the country capable of operating at such depths, had to stage their gear in the cramped, mud-slicked periphery of the basin, working under the oppressive gaze of a midwinter sun that offered no warmth to the task at hand. The water remained unnervingly clear, a crystal blue window that looked down into a bottomless indigo void. Divers reported that the deeper they descended, the more the cave's architecture shifted, with narrow restrictions giving way to vast, cathedral-like chambers where their beams seemed to be swallowed by the sheer volume of the dark. They found the victims deep within the system, far past the point where any exit remained. The cave had not just claimed them, it had enveloped them in a silence that refused to be disturbed. The entrance to Eagle's Nest Sink, nestled in the humid, tangled scrub of the Chassahowitzka Wildlife Management Area near Weeki Wachee, Florida, offers a deceptive tranquility. To the casual observer, it is nothing more than a basin of clear, still water, a quintessential Florida limestone sinkhole, surrounded by trees and the quiet, persistent hum of insects. It looks like a place for a summer afternoon, a natural swimming hole tucked away from the encroaching sprawl of the coast. But this is the fundamental lethal lie of the cave. Beneath the surface, the water is the gateway to one of the most punishing and complex underwater cave systems in the United States, a labyrinth of massive, light-swallowing chambers that plummet hundreds of feet into the earth. Among the diving community, it carries a title that warns of its scale, the Everest of cave diving. It is a place where the rules of the surface world are stripped away, replaced by the crushing physics of depth, the absolute necessity of specialized breathing gas management, and the constant cold reality that in a cave you cannot simply swim to the top when you become confused, tired, or afraid. On Christmas Day in 2013, a day meant for the warmth of family and the safety of home, Darrin Spivey and his 15-year-old son, Dillon Sanchez, arrived at the edge of that quiet sinkhole. They were there to dive. They were not cave certified, a distinction that in the realm of deep water exploration is the difference between a calculated risk and a fatal error. Cave diving is a discipline of redundancy, of exhaustive training, and of psychological conditioning that borders on the ascetic. It requires the mastery of equipment that can fail, the management of air supplies that must be calculated to the liter, and the ability to navigate through narrow, pitch-black rock tubes while maintaining total composure. To enter a system as deep and as vast as Eagle's Nest without this certification is to enter a theater where the stage is already set for a tragedy that the environment will enforce with mechanical indifference. The two entered the water, and they descended. They did not come back up. The search that followed was a grim technical operation conducted by divers who understood exactly what the system was capable of. The bodies were eventually located deep within the labyrinth, a discovery that confirmed the worst fears of the families waiting on the surface. The investigation into the incident, as is standard in such cases, catalogued the gear, the depth, and the conditions, painting a picture of a dive that had exceeded the limitations of the diver's training and experience. There is no need to embellish the moments that followed their descent. The facts themselves are heavy enough. They had entered a sinkhole that looked like a pond and had been claimed by a subterranean cathedral of water that had already, over the decades, taken the lives of both novices and highly decorated, expert instructors. It is a place that does not distinguish between the foolish and the arrogant. It only tests your proficiency against the harsh, unforgiving geography of the limestone. The tragedy of that Christmas morning resonated far beyond the local news. It served as a stark reminder that wilderness is not always found in the heights of the Rockies or the depths of a desert canyon. Sometimes it is found in the water-filled heart of a state known for its flat, sun-drenched coasts. Eagle's Nest has claimed at least 10 lives since 1981, a ledger of death that includes some of the most experienced cave divers in the world. Even those who have spent their entire lives studying the way water carves through rock, who possess the highest levels of technical certification, have found their limit here. They have succumbed to the disorientation of the dark, the failure of a valve, or the simple creeping exhaustion that sets in when the surface is 300 feet of solid stone and black water away. The system is a closed loop, a vacuum that rewards precision with survival and punishes the slightest deviation with a finality that is absolute. There is a particular quiet horror in the way the cave keeps its secrets. When a diver goes missing in a system like this, the recovery is not a simple retrieval. It is a hazardous, slow-motion mission that requires the rescuers to navigate the exact same lethal passages that claimed the victim, carrying the weight of their duty while knowing that a single slip could add them to the cave's record. It is a place that demands a level of respect that few people outside the community can truly comprehend. The surface of the water remains calm, reflecting the trees and the sky, indifferent to the fact that it is the ceiling of a tomb. It is a reminder that the land in Florida is porous, fragile, and deep. It is a sieve, and when you slip through its holes, you are entering a world that was never designed for human lungs or human eyes. As we move away from the flooded darkness of the Florida Springs, we return to the dry, vertical world, where the danger is not the water, but the sheer, crushing scale of the earth itself. We turn our attention to the Georgia mountains, to a cave system that holds the deepest freefall pit in the continental United States. It is a place of immense, terrifying beauty, where the echoes of a voice can be lost in the vastness of a single chamber. It was here, nearly a decade ago, that two young students, bright, capable, and full of the curiosity that drives people to the edges of the map, faced the ultimate test of their friendship and their endurance. They were not diving into water. They were descending into the cold, damp, and unforgiving bowels of a mountain, only to find that even the most well-planned expedition could unravel in the span of a single, heartbeat-stopping failure of equipment. One man became trapped in the spray of a waterfall, held fast by his own harness, and his friend, in an act of desperate and tragic bravery, refused to leave his side until the darkness and the cold claimed them both. It is a story of a bond that held firm even when the ground beneath them had failed, a narrative of survival that turned, in the final hours, into a testament of sacrifice. On the surface, it looks like a place you would let your children swim. Below it is 300 feet of black water that has killed the best divers alive, and on Christmas Day, it took a father and his 15-year-old son together. The next cave is dry again and enormous, and it holds the deepest pit on the continent where one young man died trying, with everything he had, to save his friend. The approach to Ellison's is a trial of patience and topographical humility, a steep, lung-burning scramble up the northern spine of Pigeon Mountain. The trail is overgrown, choked with the dense, skeletal scrub of winter, offering no hint of the architectural madness hidden beneath the limestone cap. To reach the entrance is to navigate a terrain that feels deliberately designed to repel the uninitiated. The ground is broken, jagged with karst outcrops and treacherous sinkholes that mimic the larger system's hunger. Among the regional caving community, Ellison's carries a reputation that borders on the mythic. It is discussed in hushed, respectful tones, not because of its beauty, but because of its sheer, unforgiving verticality, a place where the margin for error is measured in millimeters, and where the transition from adventure to emergency occurs with the suddenness of a snapped cord. The search that unfolded after the two failed to emerge was not a typical wilderness recovery. It was a logistical siege, an operation that required the mobilization of specialized rescue teams from across the Southeast, men and women who possessed the grit to operate on the razor's edge of human endurance. The cave itself resisted them. The passages leading to the fantastic pit are narrow, convoluted, and prone to flooding. They act as a natural filter, allowing only the most determined to pass, while forcing them to expend precious calories and resolve. As the teams descended the fixed lines, they encountered a subterranean environment that felt alien and hostile, a world of slick, mud-coated walls and roaring, high-velocity wind generated by the pressure differentials within the massive vertical shafts. The air at the bottom of the pit does not circulate. It hangs, heavy and saturated, smelling of mineral damp and the slow, grinding erosion of rock. Communication in such a place is a phantom. Electronic signals are strangled by hundreds of feet of solid mountain, and the sound of one's own heartbeat is often drowned out by the relentless percussive thrum of groundwater echoing off the limestone. When the rescuers finally descended into the depths of the pit, they were moving through a space so vast that a standard headlamp became a useless, flickering candle. They had to rely on high-intensity strobes and deliberate, rhythmic signals, fighting the vertigo that comes from standing on a ledge where the darkness below feels not like an absence of light, but like a physical presence. The scale of the recovery operation necessitated the rigging of complex, multi-stage haul systems, turning the cave into an industrial workspace of steel carabiners, heavy-duty pulleys, and tensioned ropes that hummed with the weight of the effort. Every movement had to be calculated, for in the fantastic pit, the rock is indifferent to the urgency of those who come to pull the fallen from its grip. In the mountain folds of northwest Georgia, there exists a subterranean architecture that defies the scale of the surface world. Ellison's cave is not merely a cavity in the limestone. It is a vertical labyrinth, a sprawling, jagged system of pits and canyons that plunges deep into the crust of the earth. It is famous among those who measure such things for holding the deepest free-fall pit in the continental United States, a terrifying vertical shaft known as the Fantastic Pit, where a person can drop for nearly 600 feet without the rope ever touching the rock. But the cave is more than a record setter. It is a place of relentless, driving water, where subterranean rivers and cascades carve paths that are perpetually cold, perpetually slick, and perpetually hungry for the unwary. To enter Ellison's is to enter a machine of ice and gravity, where the air is always at a temperature that strips heat from the body with brutal efficiency, and where a person is never more than a single mistake away from a situation that no amount of courage can resolve. On the 14th of February, 2011, two young men entered this dark. Grant Lockenbach, 20, and Michael Pirie, 18, were students at the University of Florida, drawn to the mountain by the reputation of the cave and the thrill of the descent. They were not professionals. They were young, capable, and, as is so often the case in the history of wilderness tragedy, woefully underprepared for the specific, merciless reality of a deep, wet cave. They had navigated roughly 1,000 feet into the system, heading toward a smaller but no less lethal drop of about 125 feet. They were dressed in t-shirts and shorts, the kind of clothing that might suffice for a brisk morning hike in the Georgia woods, but which provided zero protection against the reality of a waterfall-fed shaft in a cave where the ambient temperature never leaves the mid-50s. The catastrophe was not a collapse of the cave, nor a sudden, unheralded shift in the earth. It was a failure of the logistics of the descent. As they navigated the pitch, a bag carrying their essential gear became entangled in the rigging. The equipment did not just snag, it effectively trapped them on the rope in a position of extreme vulnerability. They were suspended in the path of a cold waterfall, a relentless, stinging spray that began to soak through their thin clothing and leach the warmth from their bodies almost instantly. In the lexicon of high-angle rescue, this is known as suspension trauma, a condition where the harness itself cuts off circulation, compounded here by the rapid, inevitable onset of hypothermia. The water, channeled through the mountain and cooled by its passage through the earth, turned their hanging position into a lethal trap. They were trapped on a vertical line, unable to free themselves, unable to climb back up, and unable to descend, while the cave slowly and methodically drained the life from them. The record of what happened in those final hours is a document of profound, quiet tragedy. Michael Pirie, in the midst of his own dying, did not retreat into himself. He stayed with Grant Lockenbach, attempting to free his companion, attempting to solve the unsolvable, sacrificing his own final reserves of heat and energy to save a friend he could not reach. Pirie died in the spray, his hand still extended in an act of impossible rescue. The Carnegie Hero Fund Commission would later recognize his actions with a medal for bravery, a somber acknowledgement that even in the most hopeless of circumstances, the human capacity for self-sacrifice persists. It is a testament to the character of the boys, but it is also a testament to the absolute, unyielding nature of the cave. The mountain did not care for their intentions. It did not care for the bond between them. It simply provided the environment, and the environment did its work. When rescuers finally reached them, they found the two young men in the cold, unceasing rush of the waterfall, exactly where the rope had pinned them. They were recovered, but the cost of that recovery was a grim reminder of the price of the pit. Ellison's cave had claimed them not through malice, but through the cold, wet indifference of its own geometry. There is no triumph in such a story, only the heavy, lingering weight of what was lost. The pit gave Michael Pirie a chance to be brave and then took him for it, and Grant Lockenbach beside him, in the cold spray 1,000 feet down. Georgia's deepest dark keeps a hard ledger, but the next cave did something the others only threatened. It kept its dead, in place, in the ice and the stone, for 41 years. The topography surrounding the cave was a jumble of jagged karst and dense, neglected scrub that discouraged casual wandering. Yet the site had gained a quiet notoriety among local spelunkers for its unpredictable hydrology. This was not a system defined by grand, echoing chambers, but by suffocating tubular passages, the sort of limestone veins that demanded a climber compress their chest to fit through the gaps. On that February day, the air temperature hung at a punishing threshold, oscillating just enough to turn the surrounding forest into a slick, treacherous expanse of slush and mud. To move toward the entrance was to traverse a landscape that felt actively hostile, where every step on the uneven, shale-strewn ground carried the threat of a twisted ankle or a slide into an unseen ravine. When the alarm was raised, the rescue effort began with a desperate, frantic intensity that quickly collided with the reality of the cave's architecture. Specialized teams from across the region converged on the site, bringing with them the heavy, bulky gear required for underwater recovery, tanks, lights, and guidelines that were fundamentally incompatible with the tight, labyrinthine geometry of the system. The searchers were forced to contend with a terrifying, rhythmic instability. The water level rose and fell with a haunting tidal pulse, driven by the rapid thaw of the surface snowpack. Every attempt to probe the constriction was met with a wall of freezing, opaque fluid that rendered visibility effectively zero. Rescuers reported a profound sense of isolation. Even with a lifeline running back to their partners, the sheer density of the rock seemed to swallow sound and intent alike, leaving them to labor in a claustrophobic, watery silence that felt older than the mountains themselves. The limestone country of upstate New York is not like the desert-dry caverns of the West or the humid, sprawling labyrinths of the South. It is a landscape defined by the relentless cycle of winter, where the ground does not just hold cold, it breathes it. Near the town of Dolgeville, hidden within a rugged, frost-bitten landscape of broken shale and limestone, lies a cave that carries a name as peculiar as its history, Schroeder's Pants. It is a tight, unforgiving crevice of a cave, the kind of passage that forces a human body to contort, to surrender its upright posture, and to slide into the narrow, jagged throat of the earth. In the winter, it is a place of absolute crystalline cold. The air inside stays near the freezing point, and the walls are often slicked with a thin, treacherous glaze of ice. It is a cave that demands a specific kind of vigilance, one that accounts for the fact that in this region, the water is not merely a feature of the geography, it is a weapon. It collects as snow, melts with the rising sun, and drains into the karst, turning dry, walkable passages into frozen, submerged traps in a matter of hours. On the 13th of February, 1965, a group of experienced cavers from a local grotto arrived at the entrance of Schroeder's Pants. They were prepared for the conditions, or as prepared as anyone can be for an environment that changes its topography based on the whim of the weather. Among them was a man named James Mitchell. He was there to explore, to push further into the system, and to test his skill against the constraints of the limestone. It was meant to be a routine descent, a way to map the reach of the passage and return to the surface before the late winter light faded. But the cave had other plans, dictated by the sudden rising tide of meltwater. As the team worked their way inward, the temperature began to fluctuate, and the snowpack above the limestone began to yield to the afternoon sun. The water did not arrive as a flood in the traditional sense. It arrived as a silent, creeping rise of icy, dark fluid that poured into the narrow chutes and filled the spaces where the cavers were moving. For James Mitchell, the cave narrowed into a constriction that offered no room for error. As he navigated a tight section, the water began to surge, rising with a speed that defied the initial, calm assessment of the passage. The pressure of the incoming meltwater, combined with the extreme restriction of the cave's architecture, pinned him in place. It was a mechanical, inescapable trap. The more he moved, the more the constriction tightened, and as the icy water rose around him, the environment shifted from a difficult climb to a survival ordeal. His companions, realizing the severity of the situation within seconds, attempted to reach him, to pull him back, or to divert the flow, but the cave was too narrow and the water too persistent. The physical reality of a cave is that it is a closed loop. There is no ventilation, no wide space for maneuvers, and no way to bring heavy equipment to the site of an accident. The rescuers fought against the cold, the rising water, and the impossible geometry of the passage for as long as they could. But the cave held the advantage. It was a space designed for a single person to pass through, and once Mitchell became wedged, that same design prevented any other human being from accessing him in a way that could provide leverage or safety. He died in the dark, submerged in the freezing, rising meltwater of a New York winter, with the surface of the earth only a few hundred feet above him. The aftermath of that day is a testament to the brutal, permanent reality of cave rescue. When it became clear that James Mitchell could not be brought out alive, and that the risk to the rescuers, who were themselves becoming trapped by the same rising water and shifting rock, was mounting, the operation was forced to change its objective. The recovery of a body from a deep water-filled constriction is not a task for the living, it is a task for the impossible. The decision was made, with the heavy, somber weight that such choices demand, to leave him where he was. The cave was not a cemetery in the traditional sense, but it was a grave, and the people who loved him understood that the earth had, in a literal sense, claimed him. They sealed the entrance of Schroeder's pants, not out of malice, but out of necessity and a grim respect for the finality of the tragedy. A memorial stone was placed near the entrance, a marker for those who would never know the name of the man beneath their feet. For 41 years, James Mitchell remained inside the earth. He stayed in his harness, in the silence and the dark, as the seasons turned and the surface above the cave changed from forest to field and back again. The world moved on, but inside the narrow, freezing passage of Schroeder's pants, the time did not move at all. It is a duration that defies human comprehension. We think of death as a departure, a removal from the world, but for more than 4 decades, he was quite literally still there, a part of the geology of the hill. It was not until 2006 that a technical recovery mission finally reopened the entrance, navigated the same treacherous, narrow passage that had taken him, and brought his remains back to the surface. It was a closure for the family, a return of the lost, but it left behind a question that hangs in the air of every cave on this list. If it can keep a person for 41 years, how many others are still waiting in the dark? This is the central, unsettling truth of the underground wilderness. It is a place that can hold on to what it finds, keeping it secure and hidden, sometimes for a lifetime, sometimes for a generation. A cave can become a grave without anyone's permission, and the stone does not care about the grief of the surface. But at least in this case, there was a location, a name, and eventually, a return. The family of James Mitchell knew where he was, and they knew that he was gone. The next entry on this list offers no such certainty. It tells the story of 3 young boys who walked out onto a spring afternoon to play near a newly blasted highway cut and simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only the haunting, empty mouth of a cave and a mystery that has never been solved. The terrain they vanished into was not merely a hole in the earth. It was a chaotic, fractured architecture of limestone and shale, destabilized by the thunderous percussion of dynamite used to clear the path for Route 79. The bluffs were a labyrinth of dead-end conduits and unstable scree slopes where the ground felt less like solid earth and more like a precarious puzzle of loose slate waiting for the slightest pressure to shift. Before that fateful Wednesday, these fissures were known to locals as a treacherous, crumbling sprawl, a place where the air grew thin and stagnant, thick with the scent of damp, ancient silt and the metallic tang of crushed mineral. The boys were not entering an organized chamber, but a shifting, porous organism that groaned under its own weight, a subterranean system riddled with pockets of unstable rock that had remained undisturbed for millennia until the highway project cracked the seal. The search effort quickly outpaced the capabilities of conventional law enforcement, evolving into a desperate, logistical nightmare that spanned weeks. Teams of professional cavers arrived from across the Midwest, their equipment rattling against the silent, looming bluffs, while state police established a perimeter that grew to encompass the entire riverfront. They utilized specialized seismic sensors and listened for any vibration that might signal movement. But the limestone acted as an acoustic trap, warping and swallowing even the sharpest sounds. As the days stretched into weeks, the effort became defined by the sheer crushing scale of the subterranean geography. Rescue workers were forced to navigate vertical drops that plummeted into pitch-black narrow chimneys barely wide enough for a human frame, often wading through freezing, subterranean runoff that obscured their footing in a churn of gray sludge. The eerie particular of the scene was the absence of any particular at all. The searchers turned up no coherent trail and no reliable trace of the boy's path, only the blank stone and the sense of a journey that had seemingly evaporated into it. Each night, floodlights were rigged to illuminate the jagged, yawning puncture in the cliffside, turning the mouth of the cave into a surreal, golden stage against the oppressive dark of the Mississippi Valley. The searchers, exhausted and caked in the suffocating, chalky dust of the blasted rock, worked in grueling 4-hour rotations, yet they found that every push deeper into the fissure only revealed more labyrinthine, interconnected voids that spiraled away from the main tunnel like the veins of a dying root. It was a landscape that seemed to actively resent their intrusion, sealing itself tighter with every tremor of the earth. In the state of Missouri, the town of Hannibal is woven into the American consciousness through the literature of the 19th century, a place where the map is famously defined by the caves that honeycomb the limestone bluffs along the Mississippi River. To the local children who grew up in the shadow of these hills, the ground was never just a foundation for houses and streets. It was a labyrinthine puzzle of breath and darkness. Most of the time, the caves were known, mapped, and tolerated. But in the spring of 1967, the wilderness beneath the town shifted in a way that defied the known boundaries of the geography. During the construction of a new stretch of Route 79, a highway crew utilized heavy dynamite to carve a path through the bluffs, inadvertently exposing a previously unknown opening into the deep, interconnected void known as Murphy's Cave. It was an entrance that should not have existed. A raw, jagged wound in the side of the limestone that opened on a world of unstable scree and fresh, unmapped fissures. To the young people of the town, it was an irresistible, yawning mystery, a new frontier opened in a landscape they thought they had already mastered. On the afternoon of May 10, 1967, 3 boys, 13-year-old Joey Hogue, his 10-year-old brother Billy, and their 14-year-old friend Craig Dowell, were last seen wandering near that fresh, man-made aperture. It was a bright, temperate Wednesday in a decade defined by the expansion of the American landscape, yet the boys were walking into a place that remained entirely outside the reach of the map. They did not come home that evening. They did not appear when the streetlights flickered to life, and they did not return when the search parties began to call their names into the gathering dusk. The search that followed remains one of the most agonizing and exhaustive efforts in the history of Missouri, a massive mobilization of police, professional spelunkers, federal agents from the FBI, and hundreds of volunteers who combed every square inch of the surrounding bluff and every accessible mile of the cavernous interior. The investigation was not merely a matter of checking local haunts. It became a desperate, systematic attempt to map the chaotic, newly blasted geometry of Murphy's Cave. Rescuers descended into the darkness with lights and ropes, pushing through the suffocating dust and the dangerous shifting stone of the construction zone, hoping to find a sign, a discarded item, or a path leading into the deeper reaches where the boys might have wandered. They found nothing. There were no footprints left in the silt beyond the entrance threshold, no scrap of clothing snagged on the jagged limestone, and no sound echoing from the deep shafts that crisscrossed the bluffs. In the decades that have passed, the disappearance of the 3 boys has settled into the bedrock of the town's collective memory as a void that refuses to be filled. The theories regarding what transpired that afternoon are numerous, yet all remain anchored in the realm of the speculative. The most persistent and documented hypothesis, favored by many of the geologists and rescue experts who surveyed the site in the immediate aftermath, was that a sudden, localized collapse occurred within the unstable, freshly blasted rock of the cave's throat. It is a reality of cave exploration that the most dangerous time to enter a passage is when it has been recently disturbed. The vibration of the earth, the shift in air pressure, and the precariousness of the debris can trigger a silent, crushing seal that leaves no trace on the surface. Others have raised the possibility that the boys might have navigated into a deeper, flooded branch of the system, or perhaps into a network of passages that were completely obscured by the collapse of the entrance itself. There is no malice in the earth, only the cold mechanical physics of stone and gravity. The investigation yielded no evidence of foul play, no trace of the boys having left the vicinity of the bluff, and no proof of their survival. They simply ceased to be visible in the world of the living, and the cave, a place that was, until that moment, merely a geological curiosity, became a tomb that refused to share its secrets. To stand at the site of that long-sealed entrance today is to confront the terrifying fragility of the ground we walk upon. It is a reminder that there are places where the earth can swallow a life in an instant, leaving no witness, no path, and no recovery. The boys were never found, and the passage that claimed them was eventually reclaimed by the very highway construction that had brought it to light, effectively burying the mystery beneath tons of rock and asphalt. The tragedy of Murphy's Cave is the tragedy of the truly lost, the absence of a conclusion, the silence that persists long after the searchers have gone home. It is a haunting that does not rely on the supernatural, but on the simple crushing fact of the unreachable. There is a profound hollow weight to a case where the earth does not even grant the mercy of a body to be recovered, leaving the families to dwell in the permanent, freezing uncertainty of the unknown. Yet there are other, more public forms of suffering that occur underground, cases where the cave does not hide the victim, but instead serves as a stage where the world watches a countdown to an inevitable end. While the boys of Hannibal vanished into a silence that has lasted half a century, the next two locations on this list performed a different kind of cruelty. They trapped their victims in the light of day, turning the mouth of a cave into an arena for the impossible, where entire nations held their breath, praying for a rescue that would never arrive. The approach to the site was a slog through the limestone barrens, a landscape that felt less like terrain and more like a ruined anatomy of the earth. The path to the mouth of Sand Cave was hemmed in by choked, tangled scrub and the jagged, weathered teeth of karst outcroppings that seemed to discourage passage. To reach the entrance was to step out of the bright, open Kentucky winter and into a drafty, throat-like aperture that bled cold air, a constant exhaling of subterranean damp that smelled of wet clay and antiquity. It was a place that possessed a singular hollow reputation among the locals, a forgotten crack in the ridge that promised nothing but labor and claustrophobia. The scale of the effort to reach Collins defied the primitive technology of the era. As the days stretched into a week, the site transformed from a remote hillside into a sprawling, mud-slicked encampment. Rescuers labored in shifts, their movements governed by the unforgiving geometry of the narrow passage. They worked with pickaxes and shovels, their bodies contorted into shapes that no human frame was meant to sustain for hours at a time, struggling to shore up the shifting, treacherous walls of sand that threatened to slough off and entomb them alongside their comrade. The air within the shaft grew heavy with the smell of sweat, kerosene lanterns, and the thick, suffocating dust of pulverized rock. Communication was a fragile, labored thing. Rescuers had to shimmy deep into the crevice to press their ears toward the rock face, listening for the faint, desperate rasp of a voice that grew progressively weaker. There were eerie, haunting particulars that etched themselves into the memory of those who stood vigil at the entrance. At one point, a reporter for the Louisville Courier-Journal found himself tasked with crawling into the aperture, not to rescue, but to document, his own limbs shaking as he navigated the tight, abrasive limestone teeth of the tunnel. He reported back that the cave possessed an acoustic quality that distorted distance. A man could be mere feet away, yet his voice sounded as though it were emanating from the very marrow of the mountain, a hollow, disembodied echo that played tricks on the nerves. The rescue party eventually resorted to lowering stimulants and liquid sustenance on strings, a futile, ghost-like attempt to tether a life to the surface while the mountain tightened its grip. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of hope, played out against the backdrop of a landscape that remained stubbornly, terrifyingly silent. In the rolling, hollow, heavy landscape of Barron County, Kentucky, the ground is honeycombed with the secrets of the earth. This is the heart of the limestone country, a place where the rain does not run off in rivers but instead sinks through the topsoil to carve out vast hidden cathedrals beneath the surface. It is a terrain of quiet fields and dense dark woods, concealing a labyrinth so dense that the map of what lies below is always lagging behind the reality of what exists. In the early 20th century, this was the frontier of the underground. Men like Floyd Collins, a man whose life was measured in the depth of a crawl and the discovery of a new chamber, treated these caves not as dangers, but as a calling. He was a man of the dark, someone who felt more at home in the silent, pressurized weight of a subterranean passage than he did under the open, indifferent sky. On the 30th of January, 1925, Collins entered a place called Sand Cave. It was not a grand cavern with soaring ceilings and glittering stalactites. It was a narrow, treacherous slot, a tight, twisting fracture in the earth that he hoped might lead to a larger, commercially viable system. He was 37 years old, experienced and driven by a restless ambition to find a discovery that would secure his future. He crawled into the darkness, moving through a passage that narrowed until his chest pressed against the grit and his limbs were forced into uncomfortable, rigid angles. He was 55 feet from the entrance, deep in the throat of the hill, when the stone he was navigating shifted. A rock, dislodged by his own movement, tumbled down and pinned his left leg. It was not a crushing weight that ended his life in an instant. It was a pinning weight, a cruel, precise constraint that wedged his ankle into the narrow, jagged gap of the passage. He was alive and he was conscious, but he was held fast by the earth. He could not pull his leg free, and the space was so constricted that he could not maneuver his body to leverage the stone away. When he failed to return, others followed his tracks into the dark, finding him held in that singular, agonizing posture. The rescue began, but it was a rescue that would quickly turn into a historic ordeal. As word of the trapped man spread, the tragedy moved from the quiet, isolated woods of Kentucky into the center of the American consciousness. It was the first true media spectacle of the age of radio and mass circulation news. Reporters and photographers descended on the site, turning the entrance of Sand Cave into a frantic, crowded, and chaotic scene. What followed was a slow-motion catastrophe that captivated a nation. For 13 days, the world watched through the filter of newspaper dispatches as rescuers struggled against the very geology of the cave. The passage was too narrow to allow for a direct extraction. Attempts to dig a secondary shaft were hampered by the instability of the sandy, shifting soil, which threatened to collapse and bury the rescuers along with the man they were trying to save. Above ground, a carnival atmosphere took hold. Thousands of people gathered at the site, turning what should have been a somber recovery effort into a morbid curiosity. They picnicked, they traded rumors, and they waited for word from the dark. Meanwhile, in the silence of the passage, Floyd Collins waited, tethered to the surface only by the voices of the men who crawled down to speak with him, to bring him water, and to offer whatever small comforts they could manage in the freezing, damp gloom. The cruelty of his entrapment was absolute. He was close enough to be reached, yet too far to be saved. He was a man suspended between the world of the living and the permanence of the earth, his body slowly succumbing to the cold and the exhaustion of a confinement that offered no room for movement. The cave held him with a grip that no amount of human ingenuity could break. By the time a rescue shaft finally reached him, the silence had taken hold. Floyd Collins had died, likely around the 13th of February, of exposure and exhaustion. When the rescuers finally brought his body out, the news rippled across the country, leaving behind a profound and lingering sense of unease. The tragedy was so complete, so public, and so devastating that it became a catalyst for the preservation of the surrounding land, eventually contributing to the momentum that established the region as a protected monument to the power of the underground. But for all the history and all the lessons drawn from those 2 weeks of agony, the fundamental reality of the cave remained unchanged. It was a reminder that the earth does not negotiate. It does not care for the fame of the victim, the frantic efforts of the rescuers, or the prayers of a nation. It is a place of absolute indifference, where a single stone can change the trajectory of a life and where the geometry of the rock is the only law that matters. Men would continue to go into these places, drawn by the same restless curiosity that drove Collins, and the caves would continue to wait, patient and cold and deep. For 2 weeks in 1925, the whole country learned a name, Floyd Collins, and learned, with him, that a cave can hold a living man 50 feet down, close enough to talk to, and too tight to save. They thought it was a horror that belonged to a rougher age. Then, 84 years later, in a cave in Utah, with helicopters and doctors and 137 rescuers, it happened again. And this time the cave was never made to give him back. West of Utah Lake in the dry hills of Utah County, there was a cave called Nutty Putty. The name tells you almost everything about how it was regarded. It was a warm cave, unusually so, heated by geothermal water, so that going into it felt less like descending into the earth and more like entering something almost bodily, close and damp and clay-lined. That soft putty-like mud gave the cave its name and its friendly reputation. For years it was a beginner's cave, a rite of passage for Boy Scout troops and university outing clubs and curious teenagers, a maze of muddy tunnels with familiar, almost affectionate names for its features. It was the kind of place you took people who had never been caving, precisely because it seemed to hold none of the terrors of the deep vertical systems, no 1,000-foot pits, no drowned passages, no rope over an abyss. It was, everyone agreed, safe. That reputation is the first thing to set down, because it is the trap the whole story turns on. A cave that feels friendly is still a cave. It still has unmapped edges, and a beginner's cave fills, more than any other kind, with exactly the people least equipped to understand that a wrong turn in the mud can be as final as a fall-down fantastic pit. On the 24th of November, 2009, in the week of Thanksgiving, a young man named John Edward Jones went into Nutty Putty with his brother and a group of friends. Jones was 26. He was a medical student, home for the holiday. He was married, with a young daughter and another child on the way. He was not a reckless man and not an unfit one. A capable, ordinary young person on an ordinary outing, doing the thing thousands had done in that cave before him, in the dark and the warm mud, for fun. Deep in the cave, Jones went looking for a feature he believed was there, a known section, reached through a tight spot he thought he recognized. In the dark, in the mud, in a part of the cave off the surveyed route, he was wrong. The passage he pushed into was not the one he thought. It did not open up ahead as he expected. It narrowed and it turned downward, and by the time that was clear, he was already head first and descending into a chute barely wider than his own body, a space, by the measurements taken later, on the order of 10 inches across at the point that mattered. He was inverted, head down, in a slot of solid rock that gripped him and would not let him reverse. He could not back up. He could not turn. The cave had let him in through a shape it would not let him back out of, the same simple, terrible mechanism that had killed a first-time caver in Oklahoma a decade before, now closed around a man upside down in the Utah dark. What followed was one of the largest and most desperate cave rescues in American history. Word reached the surface, and help came, and kept coming, until roughly 137 people had cycled through that cave over the hours that followed, working in relays because only 1 or 2 could reach him at a time, in a passage so tight and so awkward that simply getting a hand to him was a feat. They talked to him. Through the whole first part of the ordeal, Jones was conscious and able to speak, and rescuers stayed with him in the dark, kept him company, relayed messages between him and his family waiting above. Engineers and cavers rigged a system of ropes and pulleys in a space that had almost no room for one, an improvised mechanical advantage anchored to the rock, meant to lift a grown man straight up out of a hole that was gripping him by the whole length of his inverted body. For a moment, it worked. The system took his weight and began to raise him, and for that moment there was every reason to believe he would come out alive. And then a piece of it, an anchor in the rock, failed, and the progress that had been won was lost, and Jones slid back down into the slot. State it plainly and leave it there. The rescue that had nearly succeeded came apart against the cave, and the hours kept passing, and a human body cannot survive indefinitely inverted, with the blood and the weight of it pressing the wrong way. After roughly a day and more in that position, on the 25th of November, John Jones died in Nutty Putty Cave. some 150 feet from the entrance, with rescuers still in the passage who had done everything that could be done and could not do the one thing that mattered. And then came the decision that makes this the #1 story on this list, the one that no forest or desert or mountain in this whole series can match for sheer finality. His body could not be recovered. The same geometry that had killed him, the tight, downward gripping slot, made any attempt to bring him out an unacceptable risk to the living people who would have to go headfirst into that same trap to try. His family, in unimaginable circumstances, agreed to what the rescuers concluded, that John Jones could not be brought home. And so a choice was made that almost nothing in modern life prepares anyone to make. They left him where he lay. They withdrew the rescuers, and they closed the cave, collapsed and sealed the passages, filled the entrance, capped it with concrete, and they turned Nutty Putty Cave, the friendly beginner's cave that scouts had crawled through laughing for decades, into a single man's permanent grave. It has been sealed ever since. John Edward Jones is still inside it. He always will be. Sit with the completeness of that, because it is the whole argument of this film delivered in one place. Every other case in this countdown had, somewhere in it, an ending the surface world recognizes. A body recovered, a search called off, a headstone in a cemetery, a family with a place to stand and grieve. Even the ones the cave kept for years, even the ones it never gave back, live in the ordinary category of the lost. But Nutty Putty is something else. It is a cave that took an ordinary young man on an ordinary afternoon, through nothing more than a wrong turn in soft mud, and held him so completely that the only possible response of every engineer and rescuer and grieving relative was to agree that the earth had won, to stop trying to take him back and instead to close the ground over him and let the cave be what it had made itself. His tomb. That is what the underground can do that nothing above it can. A forest hides you and, in time, reveals you. A desert scatters you and, in time, is searched. A mountain kills you and, sooner or later, releases you to the melt. But a cave on its worst days can simply keep you whole, keep you where you fell, keep you so far past all reach that the living have no choice but to wall the door and walk away. We drove home from Nutty Putty on paved roads over that same limestone country, the same hollow ground that runs beneath so much of this continent, and we told ourselves, the way we always do, that the earth under our wheels was solid. They sealed Nutty Putty Cave with John Jones still inside it, because the rock would not release him and the living could not be risked to try again. And so a beginner's cave, a warm and muddy maze that scouts once crawled for fun, became one man's permanent grave, closed over him by our own hands. 13 caves, 13 people the earth took in and did not return. We walk over that second wilderness every day and call the ground beneath us solid. It is not solid. It is hollow. And it is patient, and now and then, quietly, completely, it keeps what falls in.